Hey everybody, time for another project in the shop. Don't want to do another engine rebuild. This one's going to be a 6NZ cat, but it's going to be more power than what we normally build them for. This customer that we're building it for, there's another truck in the fleet that's got a lot of power, and so the requirement for this build is we got to have it, durable, reliable, but edge out that other engine just a little bit. So, I don't know what horsepower that engine is exactly, 800 or so maybe. It's pretty healthy, but the tuner that we use, he tuned this other engine, so he's going to know what the requirement is. So anyway, let's take a look at the engine real quick. So here's our engine. Customer bought this and is just going to continue running the truck until this one's rebuilt, and then do an engine swap to put it in. It's complete. It's a real good match for the truck. First of all, this guy hauls heavy, pulls a triaxle hopper, and so this air compressor here is going to be awesome for what he's doing. Twice as big as normal. Normal's a TF or two flow 550. We upgrade them to 750 sometimes. Well, this is a 1400, so it's putting out a lot more CFMs than your average compressor. He'll like that. We got a serpentine belt set up on this, which it's going in a newer Peterbilt, and so that serpentine setup will suit the truck really well. Normally 6NZs you're seeing V-belt setups on them, so got a little bit of an advantage there too. It is a front sump oil pan, so we'll have to switch that to a rear sump and all that involves. Again, we're going to go for some power this time, so along with all your normal, bigger fuel pump, bigger tune, marine cam, and all that stuff, we'll be taking your normal single turbo 6NZ and we're going to twin turbo it. We'll be using a set of factory Acert turbos, I believe, but I think with those we're going to be able to get enough more power across the wider power band. I think he's going to be real happy with it. The engine we're trying to beat right now, it's also a twin turbo. It's a BXS Acert that's been worked over a lot, but we'll see what we can do with this. I think he's going to be happy when this job's done. Anytime you have an engine, before you pull the oil pan off, make sure that it's empty. Me and my brother once, we were doing an engine swap on a Peterbilt with an N14 in it, and we pulled the engine and we were both working on and off together with it and everything, and pulled the donor engine out of the other truck. And when you do that, no two trucks are quite alike, and these are quite different. And so you had to strip down both the engines and change all the bolt-on parts, back and forth between the engines. In the process of all that, on one of the engines, we dropped the oil pan full of oil, and so we had gallons of oil on the ground. We were making moats with floor dry, and yeah, it was one of those things that really impressed in my mind that from now on, before I drop an oil pan, I'm going to pull the dipstick, even if somebody tells me it's empty. So anyway, as for this engine, you can see got the oil pan off there, and that was like water in the bottom of the pan, sludge. When water and oil mix together, it makes a little bit of a sludge type deal. And so yeah, basically, as we're tearing this down, understand this engine was bought without any information on the engine at all. So while we're tearing the engine down, we're trying to figure out, what the status of this engine is. Why was it pulled? Just there's nothing known about it, so we're trying to figure it out as we're tearing it down. So paying attention to everything. And so some coolant in the oil pan is a big indicator that, okay, yeah, this could be the reason why they pulled it. And they decided not to fix it right. Decided to give up on the truck. And so it wasn't like gobs of coolant, because if there's a whole bunch of water in the oil, the water settles at the bottom, and as soon as you crack the oil plug on the pan, the water comes out first. So this is pretty minor, but there's definitely, signs of coolant in the oil. So we'll just stick that in our head. There is some water contamination in the oil, and it is mixed together. If it's just dumping in there, you would have had like a separation, but this is kind of mixed together into a sludge. So it's probably a slow leak of coolant into the oil, mixing together and then settling to the bottom. So yeah, just something we think about. And you can see just, pulling stuff off the front here. Like I said, serpentine belt system on this. That's going to work good for what this is going to go in. Definitely, if you don't have that, if you got the V-belt system and got to convert it over, there's a bunch of parts you're buying to make it work. So he did well for himself choosing this engine as a starting point. You just look right there where I'm working. The pulley behind the balancer, that was a serpentine belt. You got the big bracket on the that holds alternator air compressor, along with idlers and tensioners and everything. There's tons of parts that go into making a serpentine belt system. So there you can see I'm pulling the oil drain off the turbo. Basically, before I get into the internals of this engine, I want to get the external stuff off. And there you can see the state of components there. That oil feed, that's the feed line. It had pressure behind it. Those ferrules were rusted through, not much there. So that thermostat housing, it came off real quick and easy. I don't know if you noticed that, but there's 3 bolts that hold the whole housing on. They came out easy with a 3/8 battery powered impact. On the other hand, we got the exhaust manifold that I'm working on taking off right now, and I had just showed one of the studs holding the manifold on. Yeah, it was rusted and necked down to nothing where it snapped. So the thermostat housing came off easy. The exhaust manifold didn't. So that tells us that manifold's been on there forever. I'm still working on getting those manifold spacers and studs off. The spacers rusted to the studs and snapped the studs off. But the water, the coolant, the thermostat housing, it came off easy. And those are real long bolts that go through a lot of aluminum. Usually those are hard to get off. Somebody's had the thermostat housing off. So we keep all that in mind. The exhaust manifold's been on forever. Thermostat manifold has been off. So there I'm trying to get the oil cooler manifolds off of the oil cooler, and on the one going to the water pump, there's a bolt in there that I could not remove with a ratchet. I knew it was going to snap. I had to heat. That is extremely unusual. That tells me that front oil cooler manifold has been on forever. Therefore, the water pump's been on forever. And you cannot install that oil cooler or work on any of that without having that front manifold off. So we've got old water pump, old oil cooler, the oil filter base. you know, you can't remove that without having the oil cooler off. So that tells us like the bottom end of this engine externally has not been messed with in a long time. I probably should have poked a hole in the bottom of that filter and drained it, but you know, sometimes we just don't. So yeah, draining things out, tearing it down. Yeah, let's wait and watch as I screw that filter off. And there goes the oil filter base, which supports the oil cooler. Moving to the other side, start working on getting the air compressor and some of this other stuff on the intake side of the engine off. A lot of hoses and stuff there, wiring. There's the intake, you know, elbow, I guess you'd call it. Pulling that off, getting that out of the way, making other stuff a little easier to access. Normally that fuel filter wouldn't be positioned up there on top of the engine like that, but because we got that super big air compressor, they had to relocate it, you know, honestly, to a much more convenient position. If you have a normal C-15, that fuel filter on the engine there, it's kind of behind the frame rail, wrapped up in a lot of wiring and different stuff, and a lot less convenient to change out versus where it is on this setup, which takes you back to the old B models and C models, or mechanicals in general, I guess. They were mounted up where they're easier to get to. But once again, you know how engineers are. They like to improve on stuff, and a lot of times that makes it harder to work on. So anyway, yeah, just getting that fuel filter base off the head. It is a two-piece mount that was, you know, had to remove certain stuff to get it all off, or had to take the front half off to get the back half off. So just fooling with all that. There's a blow-by tube. And decided to pull the engine wiring harness loose before messing with the blow-by tube anymore. I put a lot of the bolts and stuff back in their place just to keep track of them. I mean, pretty obvious, and I'm sure everybody, well, I know everybody doesn't do it. I've had guys help me out that did not do that, but I find it a lot more easy to keep track of stuff when you put some of the bolts back and try to categorize stuff rather than make piles or whatever. So there's fuel lines at the front of the head that go from a little manifold there to the front, actually into the front of the head for both fuel and coolant. So just pulling those off, getting those out of the way. And now removing the kind of gusset between the head and the front structure that solidifies all that. Plus, it also, in this application, it holds the mount for the power steering reservoir. So just removing all that stuff. I suppose when we go to put this back together, I probably don't need the other smaller bracket that doesn't hold the power steering reservoir, because it won't apply in this application. It'll be a different setup. Let's see. I think I'm pulling a solid fuel line off of the side of the block right now. Just there's a lot of little straps and bolts that hold it in place. So I think that's what I'm pulling out now. And, you know, as we watch, let me tell you another joke. So, what do you call a fish with no eyes? A fish. Anyway, so yeah, still cutting zip ties, pulling stuff apart. Wiring harness out of the way. More wiring harness to deal with. So there's a little coolant hose I was removing, getting that out of the way. We're going to try and get that air compressor off at this point. There's the oil drain / support bracket for the air compressor. I did some checking. I didn't know if this engine was built with that air compressor on it or not, but ran the serial number and found out that this is all original to the engine. So yeah, who knows what this came out of, but whatever it came out of, it was designed to use a lot of air. Trailer with a bunch of axles or something, I don't know, but it is a special application use. Got the dipstick out of the way, make it easier to pull that air compressor off. Try and remove stuff just all around the air compressor now. More wiring and such. There it goes. Pull the engine sensor harness, it's totally free now, so try and get it off the ECM. There's the air compressor mounting nuts, pulling those loose. So I got those mounting nuts off, and so it's time to remove it. And so, you know, I don't want to break my back or nothing. That air compressor's heavy, so I called my little brother with stronger arms than me. And my right arm's still very weak. I don't know if it's really healed from the broken bones, and so I didn't want to stress it. Plus, Mark's a brute, and he can handle it better than me, so I let him do that. Anyway, pulled the power steering pump off, and then decided to address the starter that's still in the bell housing. And you can't see this because I'm not a very good cameraman, but it did not want to come off. I think if it was still in a truck with a frame rail in front of it, I really would have been miserable. It fought me a lot getting it off. I had to heat all the bolts, and they are hard to get to. I did eventually get them, but it was a struggle. but obviously I didn't catch none of that on camera. So here we are getting into the internals, pulling valve covers, pulling top end. Right there I'm unhooking the injectors, just zipping the little nuts off the connectors on all the tops of the injectors. They're unhooking the Jake brake solenoids, and so now all the wiring inside the engine's loose. That's all the internal wiring on one of these engines. It's all on that top plate that I'm pulling right now. There, it's all attached to that. Everything left, and that's just mechanics. So there I am, taking all the jakes loose, which the jakes also, the bolts that hold the jakes down also hold the rocker arms down. So we pull the jakes first, 3 of those, and then we pull the spacers that support the jakes out. And once those are all out, then we can pull the rocker assemblies out. There's 3 jakes, 3 rocker assemblies, and I got them all set up on the table over there, lined up from 1 to 6. If you look at the table, you can see a big 1 there. On the other side's a 6, so I can remember throughout this rebuild which side's which. You always keep everything in order. So there I am, loosening the crabs for the injectors, and now pulling injectors out one by one. Pulling the timing cover off. Again, like I said, we're trying to figure out what the history of this engine is. Now, those are like Torx head screws that hold that cover on, and they all came out, which says somebody's been in here. That is amazing. They never come out. I've had them where I've had to drill out and tap out every single one of those because they've been a million miles and never been touched. And that's not the case. Somebody's in this. They all came apart. So we keep that in mind. Here I am. There's an adjustable idler gear. Got it pulled out. Now we're doing the cam gear, and pulled those mounting bolts out of the cam. Wiggle that cam gear out. Set it aside. There's a little seal plate that seals between the head and the gear housing, and it consists of like 3 different pieces. Pulling that out right now. And now we start pulling head bolts. Again, paying attention to what's going on. If you see there, I'm pulling all these head bolts, which were torqued at 330 foot-pounds, pulling them out with a 1/2-inch impact. For the most part, one after another. I think I had 1 or 2 head bolts that didn't want to come out with the impact right away. So I think that's the one that didn't want to come out. So the others did. Basically, I kept going, and when it came to that one, I stopped, and I let the air compressor build up all the way. And once I did that, I was able to pull that head bolt out as well. And so that tells me that we didn't have a head gasket that's blown really bad anywhere, because if you did, those head bolts don't want to come out. But it also tells me, since they all came out that easy pretty much, that head's been off. Those head bolts haven't been in there forever. All the head bolts came out clean. If you got dirty head bolts, you had a blown head gasket. And so yeah, something tells me this engine's been into, but that manifold has not been off in forever. So this is an old head that has been off at some point. So pull the head off, and time to check out what we got. Looking at the head, seeing if it's cracked anywhere, obviously, between the valves or towards the injector. Checking out the head gasket for a cracked or blown out fire ring. Didn't really see anything. Although you never know what you're gonna find when you open up an engine, and right there you can see found a live stink bug inside the engine. So just never know what you're gonna find. Pulled a cam and rod bearing at this point because I'm just curious, like, what's the story on this engine? It's been opened up. Well, pulled the rod and main bearings, and they look exceptionally fresh for as old as that head is. Somebody's been in the bottom end of this. Looking at all the, looking at the head gasket area, look. So somebody has put the perimeter of the head gasket, or the shim gasket, between the plate and the block. Somebody put anaerobic sealant along the perimeter to seal it up. And the head gasket is an old style design before they redesigned them with the better drain seals in them. And that there is an O-ring for the oil dowel feeding the head. And you can barely see it there in the video, but you could still read the numbers on that O-ring. All those facts tell me that it hasn't been all that long, age-wise, mileage-wise, since this has been apart. But since it had the old head gasket and it didn't have aviation sealant over the entire block, and it just had anaerobic sealer around the perimeter, it tells me that it's been maybe a few years since it was done, but it hasn't been very many miles. So who knows when this engine was pulled, but everything's looking pretty fresh on the bottom end so far. So now I'm taking liner protrusions to see where they fall, and no huge surprise, they're real low. Surprise, it was blown due to, the engine was pulled due to a blown head gasket. And so I think I measured like two or three cylinders and stopped. It wasn't worth going any further. It needed torn down all the way. And looking at the block deck further, a lot of the water jacket or water passage holes, they had bad corrosion into the block deck. So decided we're just going to tear this all down. We have to cut counter bores on the liners no matter what. And the block deck didn't look awesome. And so no need to measure more liner protrusions. We know we're tearing it 100% all the way down. So pushing the pistons out right now, but before you do that, you got to pull the oil nozzles, the piston cooling nozzles, out first, so you don't hit them with the rod as the piston's coming out the top. If you bend them, you'll burn up the piston. You can see there I'm using a wooden hammer handle to help push the piston through along with the hammer. Pulling the nozzle out first and pushing the piston and rod assembly out. So they pop up above the liner, and then the rings pop out and catch them, keep them from falling down. Pull them out the top, and simple as that. So, yep. There goes the nozzle, and then I push the piston out the top. And then using a liner puller to pull the liners out. Again, you can see what an expert videographer I am, and choosing interesting angles, right? Making the viewing experience something different. Anyway, there, pulled the water pump off, getting the flywheel off right now. So yeah, you can see here, after I get all the mounting bolts out of the flywheel, I grabbed two long 7/16 bolts and threaded them into it, and made it pretty easy for me to grab a hold of the flywheel and handle it, pull it off the crank and all that. Got the entire engine assembly picked up with forklift now and pulling that flywheel housing off. Now, I didn't pull the rear main seal out before pulling the housing off. I probably should have. It came off this way, but it was more of a struggle. I had to beat on it a little bit, and then I had to eventually call Mark over, and we put pry bars on both. Well, yeah, you got to take all the bolts out before pulling it off. You can see I missed one there. Anyway, though, I had to get Mark to put a pry bar on one side and me on the other, and we kind of popped it off. But it would have been probably easier if I'd got the main seal out first. This side, I decided to get the main seal out before pulling the gear case housing off, and that made the job easier. Yeah, not much to say here. Just taking bolts out and such. Alright. Yeah, bolts on the backside. Gotta pull those out. And then just kind of gently pry away. There's 2 dowels at the bottom that kind of hold it in place. Pulling gears off. Pulling the mounts for the gears off. Yeah, basically, as I'm pulling them off, I'm just trying to be real careful, make sure that I keep all the hardware together with each piece. I think somebody'd been into this before on this front gear case, because it seemed like there's excess Loctite everywhere, and things were stuck together a little bit more than normal. Had to pry on things a little bit more than normal, but it didn't move. Another thing, when I pulled the idler gears out, there's like a kind of a stationary idler gear along with an adjustable above it, and on both of those they got bushings in them, and it's common when we pull those gears to see a lot of pitting in the gear, and when I pulled these off, there's none at all on either of them. That's another clue that somebody's had the gear case apart before and may replace those. I definitely would have expected to see something, and I didn't. And the one gear, you can pull that gear with the gear case housing in place. The other gear, you have to have the housing off. So I'm saying somebody's been in this engine. So there we decided we're going to send this block out to the machine shop and have it decked. And so I'm pulling every single plug out of the block everywhere. While it's at the machine shop, they'll put it in a hot tank and dip it and clean it. And so yeah, and you know, just my customer wanted everything resealed. So just pulling everything out of the block completely. So here we go. Basically, the last step here is to pull the crank out. So we got to flip the engine over, and so there I am, picking her up, laying her down, picking it up again, and getting it flipped upside down to get that crank. I love these straps and these hanger mechanisms. The hangers I'm using with the little tab that you bolt down along with the welded ring, that's, you know, swivel ring, whatever. It's an OTC part, actually. OTC tools, and boy, those things are just worth every penny that it costs to buy them. I got several of them, and they're really handy for securely moving stuff around. Now, again, with my theory that this bottom end's been worked on before, so those are main bolts there, and I'm pulling them out with a 1/2 inch impact. Now, you couldn't do that with most impacts, but I use AirCat impacts, and they're just crazy strong. They're very cheap, but like they'll beat out a Snap-on impact every time I've ever seen. And so they often will pull main caps on a cat, but if they've been in forever, they might not pull them. But these were pulling pretty easy with a 1/2 inch, which tells me somebody's been in there recently. And now it's time to pull the crank out. So I'm using those lifting straps so not to do any damage to the crank. You put it on the 1st and 6th rod journal and lift with those 2 journals, because that aligns the crank where the counterweights can actually clear the block. If you pull off of other journals, it'll turn the crank in a position where it won't come out. And here we get a nice look at all the myriad parts that came out of this engine, all spread out, halfway organized, where when it comes to putting it back in, I can find them, and the parts that need to go back into the engine will be in the right order with the right hardware, and make the job a lot easier for reassembly. And here we have the crank and the block in the back of my truck. We're going to have the crank polished, and so time to go.